Hello, my name is Roberto Rocco, and I'm an associate professor of spatial planning and strategy at the Delft University of Technology in the Netherlands. In this video, we are going to talk about the spatial justice of the commons. We are going to understand what the commons are, why they are important for how we plan and design our cities, why justice is crucial for the governance of the commons, and why spatial justice is a central issue for the planning of sustainable cities and communities. But if we are talking about sustainable development, let's see how sustainability and justice relate. Commonly, we understand sustainable development as development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs, as defined in the famous Our Common Future report of 1987, otherwise known as the Brundtland Report. In this definition, we find two fundamental concepts. The concept of needs that implies the existence of basic human needs that must be met with our available resources. In other words, everyone has basic human rights, which governments have an obligation to meet with the resources available. And the concept of future generations, a silent stakeholder who's not here now to claim their rights. But this notion also brings the idea that even a narrow notion of physical sustainability implies a concern for social equity between generations, a concern that must logically be extended to equity within each generation. This means that while we strive for intergenerational justice, we must logically also strive for intragenerational justice, that is, justice among all people living here and now. Sustainability is a multidimensional concept. There are many competing models of sustainability with different dimensions. But generally, it is accepted that sustainability has three main dimensions: environmental, economic, and social. It is important to realize that long-term sustainability can only take place when the three dimensions of sustainability happen simultaneously: environmental, economic, and social. These dimensions are complementary and interreliant. Social sustainability relies very much on the ideas of inter- and intragenerational justice we talked about a while ago. This is because justice must underscore all actions taken to promote sustainability. Apart from the moral imperative of providing everyone with basic human rights, leaving no one behind, justice also helps with acceptability, support, compliance, and suitability of policy. But what is spatial justice? What is spatial about justice? Is there justice to be had in urban development? In order to answer those questions, let's look at the concept of the commons and how justice plays a role in the governance of the commons. More specifically, we will look at the tragedy of the commons. This is a concept coined in 1833 by British economist William Forster Lloyd to express the negative effects of unregulated use of common resources. Now, let's see what the tragedy of the commons is all about. Imagine a field that is held in common by a community of 4 people. The field is called the commons because it's a common resource shared by the members of that community. Each person puts 1 cow to graze in the field. By doing so, they each earn the positive utility of a cow, expressed here as +1. Meanwhile, they decrease the positive utility of the field, here expressed in -1. So each of them earned 1 and the field lost 4. Now, imagine that one member of this community is a bit more entrepreneurial than the others, or they had savings and could buy more cows, or maybe they earned more cows as an inheritance. They put 3 cows in the field, and therefore, and the total positive utility of the field here expressed in +4. Meanwhile, the field's negative utility is -7. What happened here? It is easy to see that the gains are individual, but the losses are shared by all the members of that community. So what does this really mean? There's a very big incentive for the farmers to put more cows to graze in the field, and very little incentive for them to control the number of cows, because the losses are shared by all. So individually, they suffer just a fraction of the losses. If we follow the neoclassical economic theory of rational choice, in which individuals always rationally pursue their greatest advantage regardless of how it affects others, we will put as many cows as we can in the field, potentially leading to the exhaustion of that field. The boundaries of sustainability of the field have been exceeded, and no resources will be available for future generations. This is unfair for those future generations who won't be able to enjoy those resources. It's also unfair for those who were excluded from using the field because for some reason they could not access those resources. This is the tragedy of the commons. In a world where everyone is supposedly seeking their own self-interest, if left unregulated, common resources are destined to exhaustion. Well, it's not difficult to see that the same logic applies to our planet, our greatest commons. The resources of our planet are not held in common, and this is a huge problem both for intergenerational justice and intragenerational justice, as those resources are very unevenly, and some would argue unfairly distributed. Later on, the tragedy of the commons was conceptualized as a warning against overpopulation and as a defense of private property. But this interpretation has been widely rebuffed as misguided. Here, we use the tragedy of the commons to highlight issues of spatial justice. So what are the spatial justice issues in the governance of the commons? First of all, as I said before, the distribution of burdens and benefits of development in space among actors may be fair or unfair. This is called distributive justice. But also how resources are managed and by whom decisions are taken. This is called procedural justice, the justice in the procedures by which decisions about the distribution of burdens and benefits of development are taken. But that's not all. People have inherently different economic and entrepreneurial capacities. Some people have access to more resources from birth. Others have drawbacks like disabilities or other issues that prevent them from putting cows to graze in the field. Sometimes people are limited by cultural constraint. In some countries, for example, women do not have access to the same level of education as men. This creates all sorts of imbalances and injustices. Ultimately, there is a problem in the distribution of power. So let's summarize the problems raised by the tragedy of the commons so you will have the opportunity to explore these issues in depth by yourself later. Regulation, who regulates the users of common resources. Property, who owns the resources, what resources should be considered common. The role of the state, do we need strong regulation and enforcement? Who's responsible for regulation and enforcement? Individual rights versus collective rights, issues of planning, and ultimately problems about the distribution of power and information. Look at what happened when China and then British ruled Hong Kong could not agree on who should regulate a small piece of land in Hong Kong that legally belonged to China. As people could build as much as they wanted or as much as they physically could, the most important common resource, space, was quickly exhausted. Kowloon walled city has since been demolished, and now a park exists in that area. But there are other examples of irrational use of resources in urban development. The handshake buildings of Shenzhen are built inside urban villages, former rural villages where land ownership is still in the hands of former farmers. Land in urban villages is regulated differently, and landowners are eager to use their available resource to the maximum. They're called handshake buildings because you can literally shake hands with a person standing in the next building. Distribution of resources in cities can be very unequal, as the example of Sao Paulo in Brazil demonstrates. Here, you can see the richest neighborhoods in the city with their green streets, parks, and well-maintained buildings. And here, you can see what a neighborhood in the periphery of the city looks like, with unpaved streets, lack of green areas and parks, and poor city planning. But most cities do not collapse because of the mindless pursuit of self-interest, like in the tragedy of the commons. Why not? We will find answers in the work of two women, Patsu Healey and Elinor Ostrom, among many others, who looked at these questions. Let's start with Ostrom, the first woman to win a Nobel Prize for economics for her ideas on the governance of the commons in 2009. By studying the governance of the common by traditional peoples like the Australian Aborigines pictured here, she came to the conclusion that traditional societies usually did a much better job in governing and distributing their resources. Based on her observations, Ostrom came up with a few principles that generally allowed for better governance of the commons: symmetric communication, subsidiarity, and polycentric governance. And in fact, most cities around the world are able to regulate the use of resources so as to maximize public goods and distribute the burdens and benefits of development, albeit not optimally and with varying degrees of success. Patsu Healey is one of the front runners of spatial planning theory and a strong proponent of the communicative theory in planning. For Healey and others, one of the jobs of planning is to reconstruct the meaning of a democratic practice based in more inclusive practices of inclusionary argumentation. For this reason, Healey and others put a lot of emphasis in communicative practices in planning. This means an emphasis on participation of all members of a community, including those voices who are silent or whose knowledge is considered unimportant. And indeed, as Einstein well observed already in 1969, citizen participation presents us with many challenges, and there are various degrees of participation, ranging from citizen control and empowerment to tokenism and manipulation. Communicative planning is very close to the idea of the right to the city, in which citizens are able and free to shape their cities and communities to their needs, wishes, and desires. The right to the city is a right to participate in the governance of the city. And what can we conclude from the justice of the commons? It seems clear we need citizen empowerment, participation, and public debate that is fair and democratic. Despite structural inequality, we need to seek coalitions to reach some kind of consensus through communicative processes. Further, we need to listen to silent stakeholders, especially the planet and future generations, but also and most especially those vulnerable voices whose knowledge is not recognized. One of the most famous examples of citizen empowerment is participatory budgeting, which started to be used in the city of Porto Alegre in 1988. Participatory budgeting is a process of democratic deliberation and decision-making in which ordinary people decide how to allocate part of a municipal or public budget. Another example is France's Citizens' Convention for the Climate. 150 citizens representing the diversity of society were chosen at random in France to define a series of measures to reduce greenhouse emissions by 2030. Community organizers mobilized citizens from Favela Paraisópolis in São Paulo to fight the COVID-19 outbreak in face of several challenges in the slums and inaction from the state. In this way, all citizens felt invested in keeping their communities safe from the virus and to respond quickly to infections. Citizen empowerment and participation have the potential to create or recreate a public sphere. in which the conditions for good governance of the commons described by Ostrom can exist and produce more just outcomes, helping solve conflicts in spatial development, balancing powers in governance processes, increasing accessibility to public goods, and ultimately potentially delivering more socio-spatial justice. There are certainly new roles for planners and designers in this type of planning. What is your role? Thanks for listening. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to write to me. Bye for now.